there are still old gods in fear and hunger that we know surprisingly little about. Some left behind traces, magic, cults, and entire religions. Others survive almost entirely through a sigil, an old book, or a name hidden within the game files. And yet, the more we look at these gods together, the more connections begin to appear. Sylvian created mankind, but her love for what she created eventually became something much more difficult to understand. Vinushka was born from creation and destruction, became synonymous with nature itself, and according to Enki, was eventually killed by mankind. The god of the depths became part of the dungeon itself, worshipped by the forsaken and forgotten, before its body became the vessel for the birth of the god of fear and hunger. And then there are Turkil and Sarko, two gods whose domains have never been explained directly at all. One may be hidden inside a children's tale about animals competing, consuming, and surviving. The other survives through a strange sigil connected to the Black Witch, the god of the depths, Grogoroth, and a place where the boundary between life and death becomes difficult to understand. So what exactly were these gods? What relationships did they have with one another? And why do some of their symbols remain long after almost everything about them has been forgotten? In this video, we're going to look at the remaining pieces surrounding Sylvian, Turkil, Vinushka, the god of the depths, and Sarko, separate what we actually know from what we can only speculate, and see whether these scattered pieces tell us something larger about how the old gods of fear and hunger were connected. So, let's start with Sylvian. Sylvian is the old god of love, fertility, lust, and creation. Long before mankind turned away from the old world order and sought to supplant the ancient deities that once ruled over them, Sylvian was one of the old gods worshipped by man. Like Grogoroth, the god of human sacrifice and destruction, she comes from the green hue. And in many ways, Sylvian and Grogoroth are direct opposites. Grogoroth destroys, Sylvian creates. According to one account of mankind's creation, Sylvian ordered a deity named Vitruvia to create an architectural reprography of a man and a woman in her own likeness. Sylvian was so pleased with the result that she created mankind according to these drawings. So it is that Sylvian can be understood as something of a mother goddess. She brought life to mankind, while Grogoroth brought death. And from their union came another old god, Vinushka, the god of nature. This relationship between creation and destruction is important, because Sylvian and Grogoroth appear to represent two of the most fundamental forces in the world of fear and hunger. One breaks apart old forms, the other gives rise to new ones. And a common interpretation is that Grogoroth's destruction creates the space in which Sylvian can create again. But Sylvian did more than simply create mankind. She loved what she created. The Skin Bible describes Sylvian as loving her children from the very beginning. But as time went on, that love became increasingly obsessive. She wanted mankind to make love in her name. What exactly that meant seems to have depended upon the worshipper. For some, it could simply mean two people joining together. For others, it meant something much more literal. A marriage of flesh. A holy bond described as a beautiful unison of two souls, or even three. And this is where Sylvian's idea of love begins to become much more difficult to understand. Because eventually, Sylvian realized that mankind could never return the same amount of affection that she gave to them. For Sylvian, all of humanity was the product of her creation. But for any individual human, Sylvian was only one distant god among many. No single person could ever return the affection of an old god with anything approaching the same intensity. And Sylvian, it seems, could not accept that. Instead, she began to intervene. She gave mankind love magic, also called flower magic, and many of its spells seem designed around the same central problem: separation, loss, rejection, death, the limits of the human body itself. Marriage of flesh removes separation by joining two beings together permanently. Pheromones removes rejection by controlling affection through primal instinct. Rebirth of the beloved challenges death by bringing back the one the caster loves. Healing magic restores damaged flesh. Demon seed takes the life still lingering within a corpse and causes it to give rise to something new. And so, despite the name, flower magic covers an enormous range of abilities: healing, creation, rebirth, manipulation, the joining of bodies and souls. Even the cultivation of brain flowers within corpses can be achieved by those with a strong enough connection to Sylvian and her offspring, Vinushka. At the center of all of this is a very simple idea. Sylvian refuses to let living things remain as they are when they can be joined, restored, recreated, or made anew. And that idea becomes especially interesting when we consider the form that Sylvian herself takes. Studies of Sylvian depicts the goddess with obvious fertility imagery. She possesses multiple breasts, while her head has a distinctly phallic shape. The design bears a strong resemblance to depictions of Artemis of Ephesus, a fertility goddess whose body was likewise covered in repeated forms associated with birth and abundance. So while Sylvian is called a goddess and is typically referred to as female, I don't think her sex necessarily operates according to human biology. She is an old god of creation, and if mankind was created in her likeness, then perhaps Sylvian contains several principles of reproduction within the same form. Calling her female may simply reflect her role as the mother of mankind, the one who gives birth, the one who creates. And this raises another question. What does it really mean that mankind was created in Sylvian's likeness? For one, it could mean that the human body already contains a trace of its creator. Sex, fertility, healing, growth. These might not merely be biological functions. They could be reflections of Sylvian's own nature expressed through human flesh. And perhaps this also helps explain why Sylvian's idea of bringing mankind closer to herself does not necessarily mean making everyone physically resemble the goddess. Perhaps it means making the human form more like hers in principle, less fixed, more capable of being joined, more capable of being reshaped, more capable of creating life outside the limits of ordinary reproduction. Under that interpretation, marriage of flesh might not even be a deformation from Sylvian's perspective. Perhaps it is closer to correction, a return towards a more fluid kind of life. That brings us to flower magic. One of the clearest sources on Sylvian's magic comes from Blood and Flower, a text which records 3 secrets of Sylvian and Grogaroth through teachings attributed to Nasra. We'll leave Grogaroth's blood magic aside, since that's something we've discussed before. Instead, let's look at the 3 secrets of Sylvian. The first reads, "I know of the first secret of Sylvian. If I sprinkle my seed inside the womb of a freshly deceased, the life that is left lingering in that corpse will sprout a son in my name, a son that will a life of violence." This corresponds to demon seed. The caster uses the life still lingering within a recently deceased body to create a child bearing the influence of the old gods, a child destined for a life of violence. The second secret reads, "I know of the second secret of Sylvian. I no longer have to fear for separation from my loved ones, for we can forever join in a marriage of flesh, an act of love that creates a beautiful unison for 2 souls. This is marriage of flesh. 2 individuals no longer need to fear separation because their bodies and souls can be joined permanently into one new being." And the third secret reads, "I know of the third secret of Sylvian. As human beings are simple creatures guided by their feelings and lust, I can easily control their affections in a most primal of ways. This is pheromones, Human beings are driven by emotion and lust, and so their attention and affection can be manipulated through those same instincts. So the three secrets deal with three related things: reproduction, union, desire. But flower magic goes much further than these three examples. There are healing whispers. There are methods of restoring lost limbs. There is the cultivation of brain flowers. There is marriage. There is the creation of new life from the dead. And there is even rebirth of the beloved, a forbidden spell that can return someone precious from death. What all of these spells have in common, I think, is that they rearrange life. They use flesh, desire, memory, corpses, or whatever life remains inside them, and turn these materials into something living again. This is the opposite side of Grogoroth's blood magic, where his power destroys, Sylvian's power reorganizes and creates. And her healing is perhaps the clearest example. Sylvian's blessing is capable of restoring severe wounds and even regenerating missing limbs. However, according to Miro Haverinen, this healing does not simply return a person to an ideal state. Rather, it restores them to what is called their native form. This distinction is extremely important. For example, Olivia's vascular myelopathy and fear and hunger too cannot be healed through Sylvian, because that condition is part of her original biological state. Likewise, Sylvian will not restore body parts that have been willingly sacrificed to a god. Don's missing left eye is one such example. The eye was given as part of a sacred ritual. Restoring it would negate the sacrifice itself. So what exactly is the native form? The game never gives us a complete answer, but I think there are a few ways to interpret it. The first is biological. The native form is simply the body that an individual was born with. Damage acquired later can be restored. Congenital conditions cannot. The second possibility is that the native form is tied to the soul. Perhaps the soul contains something like a blueprint of the body. Sylvian's healing could read that pattern and reconstruct flesh to match it. This interpretation becomes especially interesting when we consider marriage of flesh, where multiple souls can be bound into a new physical whole. And then there is a third possibility. The native form might be causal. Sylvian can restore what was lost through injury, but respects changes made through divine covenant. Under this interpretation, losing an eye through sacrifice is more than physical injury. It has become part of a spiritual agreement, and restoring something already given to an old god might simply be impossible. Whatever the case, Sylvian's healing clearly does not mean returning everyone to a perfect human body. The limits are more complicated than that. We see another example with heroin addiction. A character like Levi can receive Sylvian's blessing, yet the addiction remains. So addiction is apparently not treated as a simple biological defect that can be repaired through restoration of the native form. And to receive these blessings, there are conditions. The first is affinity. A person must have sufficient affinity with Sylvian through worship, offerings, rituals, or acts performed in her name. Sex is one of the most direct ways. The second is knowledge of Sylvian's sigil and the correct ritual circle. For old gods, the sigil must be drawn upon an asymmetric circle. Done correctly, the ritual grants Sylvian's blessing. Lost limbs can return, blindness can be healed, movement can be restored, body can be recovered. And this is one of the clearest examples of how the influence of an old god continues even after that god has long since left mankind behind. Sylvian herself may be absent. Her systems are not. Of all Sylvian's gifts, marriage of flesh is probably one of the most important. Under Sylvian's blessing, two or more beings can be joined together in body and soul, producing a new entity. In one sense, this is the materialization of love. Two people share one body, one existence, one future. and the ritual appears to require some degree of participation or consent. But the problem is that participation does not necessarily mean understanding. Two people may agree to perform the act without fully understanding that the result is permanent. Once a successful marriage is formed, the original bodies are gone. The new body can be stronger. Missing limbs can be restored. Various harmful conditions can disappear. Body and mind can recover. Skills from the participants can remain. But there is a price. The original individuals cannot simply return. Marriage does not repair each person separately. It resolves their deficiencies by replacing both original forms with one new being. And if the ritual is attempted by someone with negative affinity towards Sylvian, the result can fail completely. Instead of a functioning marriage, the participants become an immobile mass of flesh, bleeding, wheezing, and incapable of living normally. A successful marriage can even merge again with another person, creating what is called a marriage fusion. Other larger combinations are sometimes called abominable marriages, though the terminology is not always completely consistent. The human hydra is one of the clearest examples. It was created from a group of guards trapped inside the dungeon as darkness spread through the place. Faced with madness, disease, and starvation, they attempted a marriage of flesh. It failed, and the result was the human hydra. What interests me here is how these guards even knew about marriage in the first place. Perhaps the ritual had been recorded somewhere, much like the forbidden spell used later to revive Lagarde. Perhaps the knowledge had survived from an earlier age and somehow found its way into their hands. Or perhaps the influence of Sylvian had become so deeply embedded in human culture that people retained some fragmentary understanding of these rites without fully understanding how they worked. It's hard to say for sure. Whatever the case, the human hydra shows just how far Sylvian's influence reached, even in her absence. The goddess did not need to stand before mankind for her ideas to persist. The rituals remained, the sigils remained, the magic remained, and so did the consequences. Sylvian's legacy also plays an enormous role in the events that lead beyond the first fear and hunger. And for that, we have to talk about Rebirth of the Beloved. Rebirth of the Beloved is a hidden form of love magic described as capable of returning the person most beloved by the caster. It is treated as forbidden knowledge. Its instructions are fragmented and scattered throughout the dungeon and the libraries of Mahabre. Dars, after failing to save Lagarde, follows what remains of these instructions, and eventually she uses the spell upon his corpse. This leads to her S ending. Lagarde returns, but he does not return unchanged. This is an important distinction, because Rebirth of the Beloved is different from ordinary necromancy. Necromancy animates the dead. Rebirth creates something closer to life. Lagarde returns conscious. He has agency. He is recognizably Lagarde. But there is something different about him, something unsettling. So was the Lagarde who returned truly the same man? It's hard to say for sure. The name of the spell itself is interesting. Rebirth, not resurrection. That wording could suggest that the person who returns has been born again, rather than perfectly restored. Perhaps Sylvian rebuilds someone according to a remembered native form. Perhaps the caster's love influences that reconstruction. And if that love is obsessive enough, perhaps the result can be distorted by it. Dars is especially interesting in this context, because her love for Lagarde closely mirrors Sylvian's own relationship with mankind. Dars cannot accept his death. Sylvian cannot accept separation from those she loves. Dars uses Sylvian's magic to bring the object of her affection back, regardless of what form the result may take. And under that interpretation, she does more than simply cast one of Sylvian's spells. For that moment, she follows the same logic. Loss is unacceptable. Separation is unacceptable. The end is unacceptable. And if the one you love is gone, then they can be remade. This event matters far beyond Darce herself, because Lagarde's return helps establish the world that eventually leads into fear and hunger too, and into the later rise of powers such as logic, the machine god. So Sylvian's influence extends far beyond ritual circles or healing magic. One of her forbidden spells helps set the conditions for the next age. Sylvian severed direct contact with mankind long ago, but she did not disappear completely. What remains are her magic, her sigils, her cults, and her traces. And in the first Fear and Hunger, the traces of Sylvian are the closest thing we can directly encounter of the goddess herself. They appear in the void. As you approach the bridge leading deeper towards Lagarde, or the new god form of the protagonist, the green hue begins to make you feel dizzy. Then the traces rise from it. The creature resembles an enormous octopus-like mass covered in tentacles. Each limb is capable of devastating attacks. They can inflict cuts, stun, binding effects, and the attacks of the traces affect both body and mind. Their non-elemental attacks bypass conventional defensive values and armor. Fighting the creature alone is extremely difficult, especially at the beginning of the battle, where its enormous health and damage make survival difficult. And this encounter is only available on Terror and Starvation or Hard mode. That alone tells you a great deal about what kind of enemy this is supposed to represent. But the most interesting part of the battle might be the tumor. During combat, part of the traces can take on a form based upon the protagonist and use abilities associated with that archetype. And I think this detail gives us a lot to work with. The traces can seemingly read the structure of a human being, reproduce a functional version of it, create a new form during combat, and turn human identity into living matter that can be reproduced under its control. If Grogoroth shows us the terrible scale of destruction, Sylvian's traces show something opposite. Living form itself can be recreated. Another unique ability is Color from the Unknown. This attack channels light from the green hue and devastates the minds of lesser beings, including us. And even though this is only a trace, a remnant of the original old god, it still carries enough power to show just how far above mankind these beings truly are. Simply facing one is enough to become a battle for body and mind alike. And if you somehow manage to push the traces back, the creature does not truly die. It simply allows you to pass before sinking back into the green hue. There are a couple of ways to interpret this. The first is that the traces are testing whether you are ready to continue deeper into the void. The second possibility comes from what traces appear to be. A trace is only the shell left behind by an old god. Like the traces of Grogoroth, it may simply be acting according to patterns left over from the original being. If so, then perhaps this remnant of Sylvian is still attempting to prevent mankind from pursuing the path of the new gods through the throne of ascension. Perhaps mankind is following a path Sylvian once considered wrong, and the trace continues trying to steer her children away from it. Yet, even then, it does not destroy you once you have proven capable of passing. That makes the encounter particularly interesting when placed beside everything we know about Sylvian's relationship with humanity. A mother trying to stop her children from making what she considers a mistake, but still unable to destroy them when they insist upon continuing. I think that's one of the more tragic ways to read this encounter, and it reminds me a little of Kos in Bloodborne, whose relationship with her child is also wrapped in tragedy. I've covered Kos elsewhere, so I'll leave that comparison there. What matters here is the pattern. Sylvian creates, Sylvian protects, Sylvian interferes, and even long after she has left mankind behind, the remnant of that relationship is still waiting in the void. There is another side to Sylvian's worship: cults. The bunny masks are probably the clearest example. They worship Sylvian through collective sexual rituals performed in hidden courtyards. These acts are considered sacred and performed in her name. And the rabbit imagery is fitting. Rabbits are associated with fertility, rapid reproduction, spring, desire, and breeding. But I think the masks themselves are also worth considering. By hiding their identities behind the same animal face, the participants temporarily become less individual. They enter the ritual as members of the same collective. In that sense, it can almost be understood as a lesser version of marriage. Their bodies remain separate. Their social identities begin to dissolve into the ritual, and this tradition survives for centuries. The parents of Dawn, one of the contestants in Termina, became involved with the Sylvian cult and eventually lost themselves to its endless pursuit of flesh and pleasure. Dawn is therefore one example of how Sylvian's worship could survive long after the old gods withdrew from the world. The rites remained, the cult remained, the consequences remained. There are also references to a church of Sylvian and a church of healing that preserved writings about her magic, though we still know very little about these institutions. And even in the modern era, when worship of Sylvian has clearly declined, her cultural presence remains. Bunny mask cults still exist throughout Europa. In Prehevil, the capital of Bohemia, there is even a town square bearing Sylvian's name, and that square once housed the largest brothel in the city. It was shut down by the church in the early 20th century in an attempt to regulate human desire. Now, there is another possible interpretation here. The Church of Almere presents itself as the dominant religious institution. But if you accept the theory that the modern church is actually serving the sulfur god rather than Almere, then the suppression of Sylvian worship might have had another purpose: religious consolidation. I think this is worth considering because Almere's own order does not appear to completely reject Sylvian or Grogoroth. Both remain part of the religious tradition surrounding the older powers. So if Sylvian was suppressed specifically because her worship represented religious competition, then the motive becomes much easier to understand under the sulfur interpretation. The sulfur god hates Almere and the order associated with him, and a church seeking to gather worship under one authority would have obvious reason to suppress surviving cults devoted to another old god. That is still theory, of course. But whatever the case, by 1942, Sylvian's influence has weakened without disappearing. Her skin Bible remains. Her ritual circles remain. Her sigil remains. Her spells remain. The bunny masks remain. And there are even Bremen experiments that may have involved techniques similar to the fusion of living bodies. So while Sylvian herself is absent, the system left behind by her power still operates. Before we go further, I want to look at Sylvian's story from a slightly different angle: psychology. And to be clear, this is an interpretation of the story rather than a claim about the lore itself. The basic conflict is simple. Sylvian creates mankind and loves what she created, but mankind begins moving in directions she does not accept. So she tries to intervene. She wants to protect her children. She also wants to control them. She wants them close. She fears what they may become. In psychology, a state where a mother holds strong opposing feelings towards her child can be described as maternal ambivalence. And when those feelings become tied to a moral conflict, it can resemble what is called an approach, avoidance conflict. The same object creates two opposing impulses: move closer, move away, protect, restrain. For a mother, the child remains an object of attachment, something to hold, something to protect. But the child's actions can also become something threatening, something that must be stopped. And so the mother can move between warning, protection, concealment, punishment, disappointment, and protection again. This does not necessarily mean that the love is weak. The opposite can be true. The attachment can become so strong that every moral judgment becomes entangled with the relationship itself. And I think that framework fits Sylvian surprisingly well. She created mankind. She loved mankind. Then she saw the flaws in what she had created, and rather than simply abandoning them immediately, she seems to have tried to bring them closer to what she believed they should be. Flower magic itself reflects that impulse. Marriage removes separation. Pheromones removes rejection. Healing removes injury. Rebirth removes death. Demon seed creates life from what should have ended. Even the darker versions of Sylvian's love seem to have the same problem at their center. She does not accept distance. She does not accept loss. And she does not seem willing to let mankind define love entirely for itself. This might also explain the strange historical episode described in the Skin Bible, where humanity briefly fell into a synchronized frenzy of carnal pleasure. Naked bodies spent their days in endless sexual activity. The text connects this event to Sylvian's influence, though it does not tell us exactly when it happened, where it happened, or how it ended. Whatever the case, it seems to represent Sylvian's idea of affection, pushed onto mankind at a scale they could not sustain. And there are hints that even Sylvian's healing may carry a similar cost. Some descriptions suggest repeated use can gradually damage the mind. If that's true, then reliance upon Sylvian's love can itself begin to erode autonomy. Even loving whispers is dependent upon the whims of Sylvian. The caster channels the spell. The power still ultimately belongs to her. That becomes especially disturbing when placed beside pheromones. Pheromones makes it very clear that affection, under Sylvian, does not always require consent. Human beings are simple creatures driven by feeling and lust. Their affection can be controlled through the most primal means. And this is where Sylvian's love becomes difficult to separate from possession. There is another important question, though. Are we reading too much humanity into an old god? Turkil describes the old gods as beings beyond human feeling, entities that mankind has effectively personified through worship and story. But the problem is that the stories themselves repeatedly show emotional qualities. Grogoroth is curious, Rare is jealous, the sulfur god hates, Aemon is severe, Algiz is compassionate, and Sylvian is repeatedly associated with affection, disappointment, and obsession. So either these beings truly do possess emotional qualities, or mankind has translated forces far beyond its understanding into emotions it can comprehend. We don't really know. Most of what survives about the old gods comes through scripture, cults, oral tradition, and people who have every reason to misunderstand them. So did Sylvian truly love mankind? Or did mankind interpret the attention of a creator as love? Did she want to protect her children? Or did she simply regard humanity as living material that should remain aligned with her design? I think that question is better left open. As we've discussed before, Sylvian and Grogoroth are both opposites and consorts. Creation and destruction. Together, they produced Vinushka. And if we take the theory that Grogoroth may represent something even greater than a god of destruction, perhaps even an aspect of the highest principle in the fear and hunger cosmos, then Sylvian's position beside him becomes extremely important. One comparison that comes to mind is the Apocryphon of John. In that tradition, the highest divine principle is described as the invisible spirit, sometimes called the monad. It exists before the aeons, before form, and before sexual distinction. And from the self-contemplation of this divine principle emerges Barbello, the first thought, the image of the invisible spirit, and the metaphysical womb from which the pleroma unfolds. Calling Barbello the wife of God would be too simple. She is closer to a first emanation, a divine counterpart, an image, a generative principle. And I wonder if Sylvian can be understood in a similar way. If Grogoroth and Sylvian are two opposing expressions of one greater divine principle, then their enormous importance begins to make more sense. Grogoroth destroys, Sylvian creates. Together they produce Vinushka, nature itself. Sylvian creates mankind, and through mankind eventually comes Almer, whose relationship to humanity and the old gods is central to the later religious order. The Skin Bible of Vinushka even places Vinushka and Almer side by side, describing them as having suckled from the same breast, with neither above the other. Under this interpretation, Sylvian and Grogoroth are not merely two old gods among many. They are two foundational poles, destruction and creation, two forces through which the world can continue changing form. And that might explain why even their traces are so overwhelming. The traces of Grogoroth, the traces of Sylvian, and later, rare. These beings are not truly defeated in the ordinary sense. They leave, they withdraw, or they give the one foolish enough to confront them only a brief glimpse of the scale upon which an old god exists. Sometimes that glimpse is enough to break the mind. Sometimes it simply kills you. And Sylvian's trace is perhaps the clearest reminder of this. The old god herself has long since cut ties with mankind, yet her remnant still rises from the green hue. Her sigil still works. Her rituals still reshape flesh. Her magic still returns what should be lost. Her cults still worship, and her children still live in the form she once created. If we put the timeline together, the story looks something like this. Before human history, Sylvian existed in the green hue alongside the other old gods. She was linked with Grogoroth, and from their union came Vinushka. Then came mankind. Sylvian ordered Vitruvia to design a man and woman in her likeness and created humanity from those designs. Over time, her affection became increasingly obsessive. Human beings could not return the same degree of love she gave them, and flower magic emerged as one of the clearest expressions of that difference. Marriage, pheromones, healing, rebirth, creation from death. At some point, humanity experienced a period of collective carnal obsession associated with Sylvian's influence. Later, the old gods withdrew from direct contact with mankind and returned to the green hue. But their traces remained. Their sigils remained. Their magic remained. By 1590, Sylvian's rituals were still present throughout the dungeon. The bunny masks still worshipped her. Marriage of flesh could still be performed. Her healing could still be invoked. Her traces still waited within the void. And Dars could still uncover rebirth of the beloved and use it to bring Lagarde back. Over the centuries, churches and cults continued preserving fragments of Sylvian's traditions. By the early 20th century, her cultural influence still survived strongly enough for Prehevel to have a Sylvian square and a major brothel associated with it. And by 1942, even after organized worship had weakened, her legacy remained visible in ritual circles, magic, surviving cults, the history of Don's family, and perhaps even later experiments involving the fusion of bodies. So Sylvian's story is strange, in that the goddess herself is absent for most of it. What we see instead are consequences, bodies joined together, the dead returned, wounds restored, affection manipulated, cults surviving in secret, a trace waiting in the green hue, and mankind itself. After all, if the oldest account is true, every human body in fear and hunger begins with Sylvian, created in her likeness, still carrying the functions of life she once gave them, and perhaps still struggling with the same thing Sylvian herself could never fully accept. That love does not always mean possession, that creation does not guarantee obedience, and that once something has been given life, even its creator may no longer decide what path it takes. Whatever the case, Sylvian remains one of the most important old gods in fear and hunger. A creator, a mother, a god whose love could heal, create, unite, and restore, and a god whose love could also become something much more difficult to escape. Turkil is one of 3 mysterious old god symbols that appear upon the unreleased clock alongside Amun and Sarko. His symbol occupies the 7th position, immediately after Grogoroth and before Vinushka, the old god of nature. And unlike Ammon or Sarko, whose imagery or sigils appear elsewhere in Fear and Hunger, Turkil's symbol has almost no other presence that we currently know of. As far as I can tell, there has been no official statement from Miro confirming Turkil's domain, origin, or relationship to the other old gods. So Turkil remains one of the most mysterious entities in Fear and Hunger. What little we have comes from the symbol upon the clock, the name recovered through community data mining, and a very curious character hidden within the tale of Pocket Cat and Fear and Hunger 2, Termina. So, to be clear, almost everything we're about to discuss regarding Turkil's true nature is theory. But I think there is enough here to put together a working interpretation. And the most important clue comes from a character called Turkilo the Beetleman. In the Termina version of the tale of Pocket Cat, Willem encounters a gigantic beetleman named Turkilo. Turkilo is taller and rounder than Willem's father, possesses beetle-like wings and cold insectoid hands, and wears a mask similar to the gas masks worn during war to prevent gas from melting the eyes and burning the lungs. He arrives at Willem's bedroom with an urgent request. The ancient kingdom he comes from is under serious threat, and Willem is apparently the only boy who can help. Before Willem has much time to think about it, Turkilo forces him out into the rain and leads him towards Merwood. The first thing that immediately stands out here is the name. Turkil. Turkilo. There is only one additional letter separating them. And then there is the symbol attributed to Turkil upon the clock, which bears a striking resemblance to a beetle. That already gives us a connection between Turkil, Turkilo, and beetle imagery. But there's another clue that makes this much more interesting. While researching this, I came across a theory proposing that Turkil might be some sort of animal god, and one part of that theory in particular really caught my attention. In Finnish, the word Turkilo is used for beetles belonging to the genus Nicrophorus, the burying or carrion beetles. Finnish biodiversity databases likewise use Turkilot for members of the Nicrophorus group, and Miro Haverinen is Finnish. What's more, the markings upon the shells of these beetles bear a strong visual resemblance to the symbol associated with Turkil upon the clock, so I think it is very difficult to dismiss the insect connection entirely. These beetles are especially interesting because of the way they live. Nicrophorus feed upon dead animals such as birds and small mammals. They can bury smaller corpses beneath the soil and use those remains as food for their larvae. Death becomes nourishment. Nourishment produces another generation. And when you put that beside what Turkilo teaches Willem in the tale of Pocket Cat, the connection becomes even more compelling. That said, I wouldn't call Turkil the god of animals just yet. I think the domain being suggested here might be broader than that. The tale of Pocket Cat repeatedly returns to animals competing in order to survive. Before Turkilo even appears, Willem is introduced to Meliu, his sleeping twin brother from the land of opposites, whose warning comes through incorrectly, and instead encourages Willem towards the adventure approaching his window. Turkilo then arrives and takes Willem into Merwood. But Willem cannot keep pace with the beetleman's flight and becomes lost. Crying in the forest, he is suddenly carried away by a giant song thrush and placed inside a nest full of chicks, fighting for their place in the world. Willem begs their mother for food, but the competition is fierce. The chicks already understand that survival means pushing their rivals beyond the boundaries of the nest. Willem tries to do the same and falls. Turkilo catches him before he hits the ground, but rather than comforting him, the beetleman pushes Willem deeper into the forest to teach him another lesson. There, Willem finds two enormous baby-faced blindworms fighting violently in an open clearing. They bite, claw, and wrestle, while Turkilo explains that this is the nature of men. According to him, Willem's future as an adult will look much the same. Humans become ruthless in their pursuit of riches and wealth, fighting one another just as the animals before them fight over food and survival. Eventually, One blindworm defeats and consumes the other. Then it turns its attention towards Willem. During the chase, its swollen body is punctured by a branch, and hundreds of smaller blindworms spill from its belly. The moment they touch the ground, they begin wrestling and devouring one another until only one remains. Willem realizes that this is how the giant blindworms became so large in the first place. They consume one another until a survivor emerges. And I think the pattern here is deliberate. Competition, elimination, consumption, survival. The story repeats this idea with the song Thrush Chicks, the blindworms, and finally mankind itself. Turkilo isn't teaching Willem about animals for the sake of animals. He is using them to explain a rule that applies to living beings generally. And this becomes especially interesting when we remember what a Turkilo beetle actually does. A carrion beetle takes death and turns it into nourishment for the next generation. In the story, one creature survives because another does not. A corpse becomes food. Food becomes growth. Growth leads to further competition. So if Turkilo is intended to reflect something about Turkil, then Animal God feels too narrow to me. The recurring subject is the struggle inherent to living organisms. To understand where Turkil might fit within the larger cosmology, I think we have to bring in another old god, Vinushka. This is where a larger interpretation I've been considering becomes useful, something I'll call the god inversion theory. If you look at the old gods, some of them appear to exist in very clear relationships of opposition. Grogoroth and Sylvian are destruction and creation. Rer and Aemon can be interpreted through oppositions such as night and day, cold and heat, subconscious and consciousness. And even some of the more unusual gods we've discussed before seem to follow variations of this pattern. So what happens if the placement of the sigils upon the clock is also meaningful? Turkil sits directly beside Vinushka, and if that placement reflects a relationship, then Turkil and Vinushka become a very natural pair. Vinushka is called the god of nature, but the lore and magic associated with Vinushka often focus upon vegetation, forests, earth, wind, volcanoes, geography, and natural phenomena. So rather than thinking of Vinushka as every individual living creature, I think it might be more useful to understand Vinushka as nature at the level of environment. Forests grow, soil carries nutrients, winds move, volcanoes erupt, landscapes change. The environment creates the conditions in which life must exist. Turkil, under this theory, would represent what living things do once they are placed inside those conditions. Adapt, compete, hunt, reproduce, die, become food, continue through another generation. So perhaps Vinushka represents nature as environment, while Turkil represents nature as struggle. One is the ecosystem itself. The other is the pressure operating within the living things inhabiting that ecosystem. And I think this explains the relationship better than simply calling Turkil an animal god. A forest does not consist only of trees. Insects feed upon those trees. Birds feed upon the insects. Animals compete for territory. Young fight over food. Carrion is broken down. Nutrients return to the soil. Every living thing is constantly reacting both to the environment and to other living things. Turkil could represent that motion, the continuous pressure upon organisms to survive inside the world Vinushka provides. I would still be careful with the word evolution, though. Evolution in the modern biological sense describes changes in inherited traits across generations, while what the tale of Pocket Cat directly presents is competition, selection, survival, consumption, and reproduction. So I think a safer way to put it is this. Turkil may embody the pressures that drive adaptation, and over generations, evolution. That is very different from simply declaring Turkil the god of evolution. We don't have enough evidence for that. But as a working theory, Adaptation, competition, and survival fit the material extremely well. And this is where the insect imagery becomes particularly appropriate. Insects are among the most important components of natural ecosystems. They pollinate flowering plants, break down waste, become food for countless other species, and help regulate other organisms. Remove them, and the system begins to fail. A huge proportion of flowering plants depend upon animal pollinators, many of them insects. Forests and grasslands would change dramatically without them. Plants would disappear. Animals that depend upon insects would decline. Predators depending upon those animals would follow. The entire food chain would begin to collapse. So insects make an almost perfect symbol for the relationship I'm describing between Turkil and Vinushka. The environment allows an ecosystem to exist, while the living organisms inside that ecosystem continuously maintain, reshape, and depend upon that environment. Nature may operate without conscious intent, but the conscious or instinctive struggle of living things within it helps sustain the system as a whole, and the relationship works both ways. Destroy the environment and the organisms living inside it disappear. Remove enough organisms and the environment itself begins to collapse. This is why I think Turkil's domain, if this theory is correct, goes beyond ordinary animals. It would include the entire living ecosystem of creatures that struggle, compete, reproduce, and adapt within nature. Humans would be part of that system as well. And if mankind destroys the environment that sustains it, then the same natural rule eventually turns back upon mankind. Under this interpretation, the most fitting description of Turkil might be something closer to a god of living struggle, governing the cycle through which life survives between birth and death. Again, I don't think Turkil would be a direct enemy of Vinushka. The relationship makes more sense if the two complete one another. Vinushka is nature as a whole. Turkil is the struggle moving through the living things inside it. One preserves the environment. The other drives the individual organism to survive within it. Balance and struggle, whole and individual, environment and selective pressure. This gives them a relationship that is both oppositional and mutually dependent, which is much closer to the way fear and hunger tends to treat its gods. Turkil, in this interpretation, is the thing that makes one animal consume another, because it must continue living. He governs the cycle of growth, competition, survival, death, and continuation. And the tale of Pocket Cat begins to look almost like a miniature lesson about that principle. There is another god that needs to be mentioned here, because the god of the depths also has associations with insects and other creatures. But I don't think that creates a serious conflict with this interpretation of Turkil. The god of the depths has a much broader relationship with everything cast away by the world. Decay, darkness, subterranean existence, rot, rejected creatures and beings pushed outside ordinary society and nature. So if Turkil is associated with animal instinct, competition, and the living ecosystem, the god of the depths seems to govern a different category entirely. The depths belong to what has been discarded, forgotten, buried, or left to rot beneath the world. Under this reading, creatures that remain inside the functioning cycle of natural competition could fall within the kind of principle represented by Turkil and Vinushka. Creatures pushed beyond that order, into rot, darkness, and abandonment, would instead fall under the influence of the depths. It's speculative, of course, but I think it keeps the domains distinct enough to work. One question I've kept coming back to is whether Turkilo might actually be a servant of Turkil, in the same way Pocket Cat serves Rare. Pocket Cat existed in Miro's older work before Fear and Hunger, and was later incorporated into the game's cosmology as a servant of the moon god. Turkilo likewise existed in older stories involving Willem and Meliu, so it is possible that Miro performed something similar here, taking an older character and folding it into the religious structure of Fear and Hunger. But there is currently no dialogue, book, or item description confirming that relationship. so I wouldn't treat Turkilo as a confirmed servant. The ancient kingdom he comes from makes the situation even stranger. Turkilo claims this kingdom is in serious danger and that Willem is the only one capable of helping. The entire sequence has obvious similarities to Alice in Wonderland, with Willem passing into a strange world populated by bizarre creatures. But the reference to another kingdom has always made me wonder whether we're looking at another plane of existence, some dream realm, or simply a fairy tale location inside the story. Pocket Cat itself has ties to dreams through Rare, which makes that possibility tempting. Some people have suggested that the ancient kingdom might be Mahabre. Personally, I would place that interpretation very low. There isn't enough direct evidence connecting Turkilo's kingdom to Mahabre. But there is another detail in Termina that I think deserves much more attention. The Termina versions of the tale of Pocket Cat describe themselves as being more faithful to the original than modern watered-down versions. And that's interesting because the first Fear and Hunger presents a version where Willem enters Merwood and eventually encounters Pocket Cat, while Turkilo and Meliu do not play the same role. Termina is effectively telling us that the version containing Turkilo may be closer to the older form of the tale. If we interpret that as an in-universe detail rather than merely a revision by the developer, then something very interesting emerges. Turkilo may once have been an important part of the original story and was gradually removed as the tale changed over time, while Pocket Cat remained at its center. And if Turkilo reflects a forgotten old god, then that would be a very fitting way for Fear and Hunger to communicate it. The god disappears from worship. The servant disappears from the story. Eventually, almost nothing remains except a symbol upon an old artifact and a strange name preserved in an older version of a children's tale. And this brings us to one of the darker possibilities. Perhaps Turkil disappeared because the principle or ecosystem associated with him was damaged alongside Vinushka. In Fear and Hunger 2, mankind's destruction of the natural world is closely tied to the death of Vinushka. So if Turkil and Vinushka are two parts of the same natural system, then the destruction of one could conceivably devastate the other. Destroy the environment and the living ecosystem dependent upon it disappears. Destroy enough of the living ecosystem and the environment collapses in return. Under that interpretation, Turkil's disappearance from human memory could parallel the destruction of the natural systems he represented. His name fades. His stories disappear. His sigil survives only upon an old clock. And Turkilo's appearance in the supposedly more faithful version of the tale becomes one of the last cultural remnants of a forgotten god. There is an interesting visual detail that could support this interpretation, though I want to stress that this is much more speculative. Turkilo wears a gas mask, and Termina specifically describes it in terms of warfare, a mask like the one Willem's grandfather wore to stop gas from destroying his eyes and lungs. Gas masks immediately evoke industrial warfare and the environmental consequences of modern conflict. War, industry, and chemical weapons are among the clearest examples of mankind developing methods capable of devastating entire environments. So Turkilo, a beetleman potentially associated with a god of living ecosystems, arrives wearing protection against the products of human war, while asking for help saving an ancient kingdom. I find that image very difficult to ignore. Perhaps the kingdom is being destroyed by the same kind of human progress that eventually destroys the natural systems represented by Vinushka. Perhaps Turkilo's request is a symbolic warning that mankind is destroying the domain his god represents. But again, this is interpretation. It is also entirely possible that Miro simply hasn't finished developing Turkil as a concept. Turkil may be an abandoned or unfinished deity whose domain was never fully decided. The lack of information could reflect future plans, an idea that changed during development, or something Miro simply hasn't chosen to explain yet. The actual answer remains unknown. There is one more theory worth mentioning, though I would rank it much lower than the insect and survival interpretations. Could Turkil have been another child of Sylvian and Grogoroth? Perhaps even something like a sibling or counterpart to Vinushka. We know Vinushka was born from the union of Sylvian and Grogoroth, and upon the clock, Turkil's sigil appears after Grogoroth and immediately before Vinushka. If that ordering has any genealogical significance, then it raises the possibility that Turkil belongs to the same generation. Conceptually, the idea works surprisingly well. Sylvian represents creation. Grogoroth represents destruction. Vinushka emerges as nature, a balance produced from those two forces. Turkil could then represent survival and selection, another consequence of creation and destruction acting together. Living things are born. Living things destroy and consume one another. Some survive, others die. And through that struggle, life continues. It's a compelling structure. But there is currently no canonical text stating that Turkil is the child of Sylvian and Grogoroth. So I would keep this theory well below the others. The clock position is interesting. It is not enough to establish parentage. So where does that leave us? If I had to build a working theory from the evidence we currently have, I wouldn't describe Turkil simply as the god of animals. The beetle imagery strongly suggests an association with insects or living creatures, but the tale of Pocket Cat repeatedly pushes the idea much further. Turkilo shows a Willem song thrush chicks competing for food. He shows him blindworms fighting, consuming one another, and producing another generation through that consumption. And then he tells Willem directly that this is the nature of men, extending the same rule to humanity's pursuit of riches and wealth, competition, consumption, survival, reproduction. The carrion beetle connection fits the same pattern because death becomes nourishment for new life. And beside Vinushka, a larger structure begins to emerge. Vinushka could represent the natural environment itself, forests, soil, weather, terrain, growth, and the broader balance of nature. Turkil could represent the living ecosystem struggling inside that environment. Animals, insects, humans, and other organisms driven by instinct or conscious desire to survive, reproduce, and overcome competing life. Under this interpretation, Turkil embodies the pressures that drive adaptation and eventually evolution, rather than evolution itself. He is the struggle within the ecosystem, the cycle in which living things are born, compete, consume, reproduce, die, and become nourishment for what follows. And mankind is part of that cycle, whether it likes it or not. This would also explain why Turkil and Vinushka need one another. Nature provides the conditions in which life exists. Living ecosystems help maintain and reshape nature. Remove one, and the other eventually suffers. So Turkil would not simply oppose Vinushka. He would complete Vinushka. And if that is really what Miro intended, then Turkil would fit the old gods of fear and hunger extremely well. He wouldn't merely govern a category of creatures. He would represent a fundamental rule of existence, a law of living things operating inside the natural world. But until we receive more information, that's as far as I think we can reasonably take it. Turkil remains a name, a beetle-shaped sigil, a strange position upon an old clock, and perhaps the shadow of a forgotten god hiding inside a children's tale. The older god that came to be from the union of Sylvian and Grogoroth. Vinushka is synonymous with the nature. The god appears in different forms in different regions of the world. This is only natural as the nature itself appears in different forms around the world as well. This is how the new gods describe Vinushka, and I think the wording here is important. Vinushka is not described merely as a god that commands nature. Vinushka is said to be synonymous with nature itself. According to the Skin Bible, Vinushka was born from the union of Sylvian and Grogoroth, the two old gods whose principles are creation and destruction. And this makes a great deal of sense, because the cycle of creation and destruction is seen in its purest form In nature, a forest grows, a forest burns, the dead return to the soil. New life grows from what remains. Like mankind, Vinushka is described as having a volatile temperament, capable of changing from a fiery, raging volcano to a serene grassland where a gentle wind lulls one to sleep. So calling Vinushka simply a god of plants would miss most of what this deity represents. Fire belongs to Vinushka. Forests belong to Vinushka. Roots, sunlight, growth, volcanic destruction, and the restoration that follows it all exist within the same domain. And that duality is reflected directly in Vinushka's magic. There are 7 notable skills associated with the god. Pyromancy trick is a simple spell used to burn an opponent. Combustion allows a talented wizard to manipulate heat in the atmosphere and create a large burst of flame. Scorched earth completely burns the surrounding area and creates an environment that enhances fire attacks. Spontaneous combustion is described as the highest form of pyromancy, where the user becomes flame itself. Roots that reap sends a shockwave underground before forcing sharp roots through the earth. Photosynthesis and greater photosynthesis use sunlight to gradually restore health. Some of these skills also require affinity with Sylvian or Grogoroth, reinforcing Vinushka's relationship with both parent gods. Scorched earth is associated with Grogoroth. Heartflower and brainflower connect Vinushka with Sylvian. The pattern is pretty clear. Sylvian supplies growth, reproduction, and regeneration. Grogoroth supplies destruction, fire, and death. Vinushka is what happens when those forces exist together as a cycle. I think this is more useful than describing Vinushka as a balance between 2 extremes, because nature does not simply sit between creation and destruction. Nature moves between them. Creation becomes destruction. Destruction produces material for creation. Life becomes death, and death becomes life again. Vinushka's sigil reflects this rather well. It resembles a swirling maelstrom, an appropriate symbol for something defined by constant movement and change. Drawing that sigil upon an asymmetric circle can cause an otherworldly tree to erupt from the ground almost immediately, creating a path, shortcut, or route into another part of the environment. Engraving the same mark upon the face increases otherworldly offense. So even the practical use of Vinushka's sigil reflects the same idea. The environment changes. The landscape opens. Life forces its way through the ground. And there is another important detail in the Skin Bible. Vinushka's original name was apparently not Vinushka at all. According to Enki's unedited text, Sylvian originally named the god Ninush. The unedited Skin Bible gives us one of the strangest accounts of an old god's birth in the series. It says that the seed of Grogoroth had been fermenting for an aeon before finally reaching maturity, after which Sylvian pushed out an entire pine cone and named the child Ninush. It's grotesque, but it also fits the deity remarkably well. A pine cone carries seeds. It is part of the reproductive cycle of a tree, yet it is hard, dry, and almost lifeless in appearance. New life remains inside something that already resembles dead material. So for the offspring of Sylvian and Grogoroth, creation and destruction, a pine cone is almost too appropriate. The illustration in this unedited Skin Bible depicts Vinushka with a pine cone for a head, while the more common Vatican version gives the deity a considerably more human face. And I think that difference deserves attention. The original presentation makes Vinushka look deeply non-human, closer to vegetation than mankind. The censored version makes nature easier to recognize as a person. Perhaps this is merely an artistic change, or perhaps the Vatican deliberately anthropomorphized Vinushka, turning something strange and difficult to understand into a god that fits more comfortably within human theology. Whatever the case, the new gods make it clear that even these depictions cannot necessarily be treated as a single true form. They say Vinushka appears differently in different regions because nature itself appears differently across the world. A Vinushka associated with mountains might therefore look very different from one associated with forests, plains, or volcanic land. The image in the Skin Bible could be one representation among many. This also fits a broader problem with the theology of fear and hunger. Much of what we know about gods comes from human beings. Priests write books. Cultures develop different traditions. Scholars disagree. Scriptures are edited. And the same divine entity can be understood differently depending on where and when the story is told. So even the statement that Vinushka is the child of Sylvian and Grogoroth should probably be understood as the strongest theological account we currently have, rather than proof of biological reproduction in anything resembling the human sense. That said, the relationship does explain Vinushka's nature exceptionally well. Sylvian is creation, Grogoroth is destruction. Vinushka inherits both, and according to Enki, the ancient relationship between mankind and this god began very differently from how it ended. Humanity once lived in symbiosis with nature. People existed alongside its cycles of creation and destruction, rather than attempting to dominate them. But civilization grew. Humans became increasingly greedy and hostile towards the land they occupied. Forests and natural environments were destroyed to make room for civilization. Nature was treated as something to be conquered. And Vinushka changed in response. Enki describes something very close to a reflection. Mankind became hostile, and so Vinushka became hostile. Humans attempted to master nature, and nature turned upon humanity in return. Eventually, a long war began to determine who would become the master and who would become the slave. And according to Enki, mankind won. Enki is unusually direct about what happened next. Vinushka died by the hands of men. For all intents and purposes, he writes, nature is dead, and only after this death did the name Vinushka emerge. Sylvian's child had originally been Ninush. Vinushka came afterwards, a name Enki connects to guilt, the great guilt of mankind. This gives the name an entirely different meaning. Vinushka is no longer simply the name of an old god. It becomes a memorial to what humanity did to that god. The guilt will surely eat away the known world in time, Enki says, while faint traces of Vinushka remain in totems that desperately search for the murdered deity in vain. He even wonders whether these totems are themselves manifestations of human guilt. And then, in typical Enki fashion, he ends this account with the line, "For now, it's best to exploit nature while we still can." The entire story makes Vinushka one of the strangest old gods in the setting. Rare left the world. Grogoroth and Sylvian left traces behind. The god of the depths was eventually replaced. But Vinushka, according to Enki, was actually killed by humanity. The problem is that this version of events is not uncontested. The Vatican version of the Skin Bible removes almost every important part of this story. Ninush is gone. The pinecone birth is gone. The period of symbiosis between humans and nature is gone. Human greed is gone. The war is gone. Vinushka's death is gone. The connection between the name and guilt is gone. The totems searching for their murdered god are gone. And the warning that humanity's guilt will one day consume the world is gone. In their place appears a very different theology. Vinushka and Almer, the representation of humanity, are described as equal. Both were reared by Sylvian. Neither stands taller than the other. And then comes what might be the most politically significant line in the entire censored text. What is Vinushka's is for men to reap, just as nature reaps our old and weary. That's not a small revision. The unedited text describes civilization destroying nature, fighting it, and eventually killing it. The censored version says humanity and nature are equals, and that the resources of nature are mankind's to take. One account presents exploitation as the act that caused a catastrophe. The other effectively legitimizes exploitation as part of the natural order. And if Enki is correct, then the Vatican version starts to look very much like history written by the winner. Humanity fought nature for the right to become master. Humanity won. Then human religion produced a text explaining that mankind had always possessed the right to reap what belonged to nature. Agriculture, mining, logging, hunting, settlement, and industrial expansion can all fit comfortably inside that worldview. So why would the Vatican conceal Vinushka's death? There are a few possibilities. Acknowledging that mankind killed an old god would establish a dangerous precedent. If human ancestors could destroy a true god, then divine beings are not necessarily beyond mankind's reach. It would also turn the development of civilization itself into something approaching an original sin, because the growth of human society would be directly associated with the destruction of nature. And perhaps most importantly, a religious institution tied to civilization has obvious reason to present nature as a legitimate resource rather than a murdered divine being. I think the possibility that the Vatican suppressed this history to prevent humanity from recognizing what was happening to the natural world is worth considering. But that remains my interpretation. What the game gives us directly is censorship. And the person most closely associated with that censorship may be Donovan Hugo. The Common Skin Bible is credited to Enki Ankarian, but edited by Donovan Hugo, while an unedited copy can be found hidden inside Hugo's own home. Hugo also wrote the God Manifesto, and in that text he attacks a well-known dark priest in occult circles whose beliefs he considers absurd. He never names Enki directly, so we cannot prove beyond doubt that Enki is the target, but the description fits extremely well. And the specific claim Hugo attacks is the idea that an old god can die. How do you kill an idea, an inspiration, or one of the primordial concepts once it is conceived? He asks. According to Hugo, once an old god is born, it has existed forever. Gods, like human souls, are not constrained by linear time and space. They can reincarnate at different points across history without mankind understanding what is happening. They arise from the green stream, but Hugo even questions which comes first, the physical old god or the concept produced through consciousness. In his view, new gods should never be confused with beings of this scale. New gods are merely puppets attempting to become puppeteers, byproducts of the immense influence old gods exert upon mankind. Hugo's argument creates one of the biggest ontological questions surrounding Vinushka. Enki says Vinushka died. Hugo says the death of an old god is absurd. And the game does not step in to tell us which one is correct. There are a few ways to reconcile the contradiction. Perhaps Vinushka literally died and Enki is correct, establishing that even an old god can ultimately be destroyed. Perhaps humanity destroyed only Vinushka's physical manifestation while the concept of nature remained. Perhaps Ninush died as a conscious divine entity, while nature continued without a unified will behind it. Or perhaps the entire death of Vinushka is historical metaphor, describing the moment civilization destroyed its old relationship with wild nature and replaced it with an environment controlled, exploited, and reorganized for human use. I think the line, "nature is dead," becomes especially important here. Obviously, plants still grow in 1942. Animals remain alive. Olivia can study botany. Vinushka's spells still function. So Enki cannot simply mean that every biological process called nature ceased to exist. Maybe nature lost its divine agency. The system continues, but the consciousness once identified as Vinushka is gone. Or perhaps what remains are traces, in much the same way that blood magic continues to function after Grogoroth has withdrawn from the world. This possibility becomes stronger when we consider the way some characters describe magic itself. Osea makes a particularly useful point when explaining the relationship between yellow mages and the old gods. A blacksmith does not need to pray to Vinushka before using fire to bend iron. He simply harnesses the flame. That line suggests old god magic does not always function like a priest asking a deity to personally grant a miracle. The forces associated with a god may continue to exist as part of reality itself. A caster learns how to access them. And this gives us a very simple way to understand how Vinushka could be dead while Vinushka magic remains. A scientist can die while the physical law he described continues to operate. If Vinushka truly is synonymous with nature, then perhaps the deity is less a person controlling natural forces and more the divine subject through which those forces are understood. Humanity might have killed the conscious god without stopping fire from burning, roots from growing, or sunlight from feeding plants. That said, Hugo's argument remains difficult to dismiss, because if an old god is genuinely a primordial concept, then killing the manifestation might not remove the concept at all. And this ambiguity seems entirely intentional. Enki says faint traces of Vinushka still linger in totems, deities that desperately search for the murdered god in vain. Unfortunately, the game does not tell us exactly what these totems are. We don't know how many exist, whether they possess independent consciousness, whether they are literally traces of Vinushka or manifestations of human guilt, or whether creatures such as the Ikiturso should be included among them. But the Ikiturso gives us perhaps the clearest living connection to Vinushka outside the Skin Bible. The new gods describe the Ikiturso as peculiar beasts that roam the deepest forests of Europa. They have a clear alignment with Vinushka, though even the new gods admit that the exact nature of this connection is unknown. They are also said to rise from their slumber when nature is under threat. The Ikiturso encountered in Termina remains asleep, waiting for Vinushka. When disturbed, it asks whether the time has finally come. When it realizes Vinushka has not returned, it dismisses the player as a worm and returns to its sleep. If Enki is correct, this becomes a fairly tragic scene. The creature may be waiting for a god that will never return, a servant remaining at its post after its master has already died. Or perhaps it knows what happened and believes that nature can eventually be reborn. The name itself also appears to draw from Finnish mythology. Ikuturso, or Ikitursis, is a monstrous being from the Kalevala. In one story, the creature rises from the sea and burns hay into ash, from which an enormous oak eventually grows. In another, Louhi summons Ikuturso against Wainamoinen, only for Wainamoinen to seize the monster and banish it back beneath the sea. The fear and hunger creature is referred to as an elk man by Marina, and as an elkling in the game files. So Miro is clearly not adapting the mythological creature directly. But the association between the name, ancient nature, and the emergence of great plant life is interesting. A creature resembling an Ikiturso also appears among the beings killed by Ragnvaldr in his S ending. Whether that creature belongs to the same species remains uncertain. There are other possible remnants of Vinushka's worship as well. The owl cultists in Termina live deep within the forest, cover themselves in foliage, summon animal spirits, and seem willing to tolerate the player if the forest is respected. Their owl masks have even fused with their flesh, much like Pocket Cat's animal identity is inseparable from his service to an old god. The game never directly says these cultists worship Vinushka, so this should remain speculation. Personally, I think they could reflect an overlap between Vinushka and the kind of living ecosystem we discussed previously in relation to Turkil, rather than belonging cleanly to one deity. What matters for Vinushka is that by 1942, the god no longer appears to have an obvious major church. Knowledge survives instead through folklore, botany, and occult scholarship. Olivia is a great example. If her studies focus on the folkloristic side of botany, she receives the Skin Bible of Vinushka. When recruited, she can also possess photosynthesis from Vinushka's skill tree. That tells us something interesting about the modern world of fear and hunger. The distinction between natural science and occult theology isn't always very clear. A botanist can discover Vinushka through the study of plants. Magic and biology overlap because the divine force associated with nature is embedded in the same processes scientists are studying. And this brings us back to Vinushka's spells. Photosynthesis requires sunlight. Unlike many forms of god magic, the spell depends directly on environmental conditions. It behaves less like a miracle detached from nature and more like the manipulation of a natural law. Again, perhaps Vinushka does not grant the process. Perhaps Vinushka is the process. Vinushka's relationship with Sylvian and Grogoroth helps explain nearly every strange aspect of this domain. Grogoroth is more than a biological father in this mythology. His principle of destruction exists inside Vinushka. The Skin Bible of Grogoroth explains that destruction is necessary because without clearing away old forms, there is no room for creation to continue. And that is exactly what nature does. Volcanoes destroy land and create new ground. Forest fires kill, clear, and fertilize. Predation transfers life through death. Decomposition returns dead matter to the ecosystem. Ecological catastrophe itself is still nature. This is why fire magic belongs comfortably within Vinushka's domain. Scorched earth even requires a relationship with both Grogoroth and Vinushka. Sylvian provides the other side. Growth, reproduction, regeneration, plants, photosynthesis, flowers. But creation without destruction would not produce a functioning ecosystem. A forest without death, decomposition, predation, or limitation would cease to behave like nature. So perhaps Vinushka is what happens when Sylvian's creation is given mortality by Grogoroth. Life grows because other life ends. The remains become the material for what follows. And this makes the Maelstrom sigil even more appropriate. Vinushka is movement, the cycle itself. Creation becomes destruction, and destruction returns to creation. Miro has stated that Vinushka was partially inspired by the song Vinushka by Deer and Grey. That song appears on the album Ouroboros, whose imagery centers upon repeating cycles of life, death, and rebirth. Even the Ouroboros itself, the serpent consuming its own tail, fits remarkably well with the kind of cycle Vinushka embodies. I wouldn't use that as proof of any specific lore claim, of course, but thematically the connection is very strong. And there is an additional issue worth mentioning here. Vinushka is called an old god, even though the deity is said to have been born from two other old gods. So, old god does not necessarily mean that every member of the category existed from the same first moment. It might describe an ontological class rather than a simple age category. Vinushka can be born later and still exist upon the same divine level. Likewise, while Sylvian and Grogoroth are associated with the green hue, I haven't found a canonical statement saying Vinushka was personally born there. That should remain open. There is also some strange iconography surrounding Vinushka that may point towards an even larger cosmological relationship. Alongside the god's symbol in the Skin Bible are several additional signs. Two resemble the alchemical symbol for fire, while another resembles the all-seeing eye, an image we've discussed before in connection with the highest divine principle in fear and hunger. If that interpretation is correct, the presence of the eye beside Vinushka and the fact that Vinushka is descended from Grogoroth would strengthen the theory that Grogoroth is somehow directly related to that supreme god, perhaps as one of several identities or manifestations through which that principle appears. It could also help explain why Vinushka possesses old god-level power despite being born from two existing old gods. And because Vinushka's magic includes sunlight and fire, there is another possible connection to the theory that this highest god may once have been associated with an ancient solar deity, with later beings such as Amun inheriting related aspects. To be clear, this is deep speculative territory. The symbols do not confirm that model. One additional symbol appearing in the Skin Bible remains unexplained entirely. I haven't been able to identify it through the Nordic runic systems or alchemical symbols I've looked through. So for now, I think it's better to leave that one open. The most important thing about Enki's account is that Vinushka does not simply attack humanity without cause. The relationship changes in response to human behavior. Ancient people once lived in symbiosis with nature. Then civilization expanded. Humans became greedy and hostile. Vinushka became hostile in return. So nature behaves almost like a mirror. Treat it as something to live alongside, and the relationship remains relatively peaceful. Treat it as a resource to conquer, and nature becomes an opponent. Eventually, mankind turned that conflict into a war over who would become master and who would become slave. And this makes the alleged death of Vinushka particularly disturbing. Humanity and Vinushka are not completely unrelated forces. According to the censored Skin Bible, both were reared by Sylvian. The same text even places Vinushka beside Almir, representation of humanity, saying neither stands taller. Now, that section does not appear in Enki's unedited account, which makes the exact theology suspicious. But the broader connection between humanity and Sylvian remains. So if mankind killed Vinushka, this was not simply victory over an external enemy. Humanity destroyed the environment that allowed humanity to exist. And when Enki says guilt will one day eat away the known world, perhaps he does not mean a supernatural curse at all. The consequence can be entirely material. Destroy the environment. The environment can no longer sustain civilization. Civilization eventually suffers from the destruction it caused. In that sense, guilt consumes the world because the effects of mankind's actions return to mankind. This is also why I find the Vatican's wording so important. What is Vinushka's is for men to reap. If the unedited account is true, that line converts the result of a war into religious law. Humanity defeated nature, then wrote a theology declaring that the resources of nature were always humanity's rightful property. And Almir becomes useful in this construction because he represents humanity itself. The censored text places humanity and nature side by side as equals, while simultaneously granting humanity the right to harvest what belongs to Vinushka. Again, perhaps this is simply one theological interpretation. But if Hugo or the Vatican intentionally changed the text, then the political motive is difficult to ignore. Hugo himself makes the situation even stranger because he uses magic associated with Vinushka, including scorched earth and combustion. He isn't merely a scholar writing from outside occult practice. He actively harnesses the same forces whose theology he is helping to redefine. And that fits Osei's explanation rather well. You do not need to worship a god in order to use the force associated with it. A man can deny that Vinushka died and still harness Vinushka's flame. There is another part of this story that I think connects Vinushka to the larger direction of the series. The god of fear and hunger opened the cruel age. Fear pushed mankind forward. Hunger ensured that mankind continued moving. Cities expanded. Industry developed. Technology accelerated. The Skin Bible of the god of fear and hunger directly associates this new age with modern cities, factory smoke, and human progress. And progress of this kind inevitably increases humanity's ability to exploit the natural world. Forests can be cleared faster. Resources can be extracted on a larger scale. Landscapes can be reshaped. Industrial civilization becomes capable of doing in generations what earlier societies could only do across centuries. If Vinushka's death came from mankind's long war against nature, then the cruel age would accelerate the conditions that caused that death. This brings us to logic. I've discussed the machine god in much greater detail elsewhere, so I'll keep the argument focused here. At the end of Termina, Logic appears with a cube-like artifact attached to her chest. The object strongly resembles the Cube of the Depths, except it bears Vinushka's sigil, and that sigil has been crossed out. I think this detail is extremely important. My working theory has been that a newly ascended god, capable of reaching something close to the level of an old god, needs access to a domain already built into the structure of the world. We see a possible precedent with the god of fear and hunger and the god of the depths. and perhaps another with Almir and the older solar power we've discussed before. Under this model, divinity is limited by domains. A new power of this scale cannot simply appear from nothing. Something existing must be replaced, inherited, or restructured. Logic may have taken advantage of the weakening of Vinushka's domain after mankind devastated nature. But unlike the god of fear and hunger, who resembles a much more direct replacement for the depths, logic does not simply reproduce Vinushka. She transforms the domain into something new. Vinushka represents natural interconnectedness. Logic represents technological interconnectedness. One connects life through ecosystems, land, growth, and natural cycles. The other connects humanity through machines, networks, and shared consciousness. So if logic did replace Vinushka, mankind would have moved from ecological interconnectedness to technological interconnectedness. That would also explain why Vinushka's sigil appears upon logic's body, but has been crossed out. The old foundation remains visible beneath the new god. The domain has been inherited and rewritten. Again, this is theory. The game does not state directly that logic replaced Vinushka, but the visual connection is difficult to ignore, especially when placed beside Enki's claim that nature is dead, and the broader history of industrial progress leading into 1942. In that sense, the god of fear and hunger, the death or disappearance of Vinushka, and the birth of logic begin to look like parts of the same historical movement. Fear and hunger drive humanity into the cruel age. The cruel age accelerates civilization and industrialization. Civilization destroys nature. The weakened domain creates space for a new form of interconnectedness, and logic emerges. Perhaps this was never literally predetermined, but looking backwards, the sequence almost feels inevitable. By the time of Termina, Vinushka no longer appears as an obvious conscious deity interacting with mankind, but the domain is everywhere. Vinushka's sigil still functions. Trees still answer when the mark is drawn upon an asymmetric circle. Photosynthesis still draws upon sunlight. Fire magic still burns. Roots still break through the earth. Iki Turso still waits for the god's return. Folklore preserves the name. Botanists can encounter the theology through the study of plants. Owl cultists may preserve some form of forest-oriented worship, and traces or totems may still be searching for what Enki says mankind killed long ago. So perhaps the strangest thing about Vinushka is that the world continues to behave as if the god is present, even while multiple sources suggest that the god is gone. This is why Osa's explanation matters so much. A force can remain after the deity associated with that force disappears. Fire continues. Photosynthesis continues. Nature continues in some form. The question is whether the conscious divine subject called Ninush or Vinushka continues with it. And even the name may complicate that answer. If Enki is right, Ninush was the original child. Vinushka was the name that emerged after humanity killed that child. So perhaps what people worship in later centuries as Vinushka is already a posthumous identity, a god remembered through guilt rather than the exact being Sylvian originally created. Maybe Ninush and Vinushka are simply two names for the same entity before and after one historical event. Or perhaps the distinction is more important than that. We don't know. And this is where Hugo's argument returns. If old gods exist outside linear time, can a god really have a before death and after death in the way humans understand those terms? Can Ninush die in history while the concept Vinushka continues to exist across time? Can nature be dead as a god and alive as a process? Can an old god reincarnate after humanity believes it has killed the previous manifestation? These questions are still unresolved, and I think that ambiguity is intentional. So what can we say with confidence? Vinushka is an old god associated so closely with nature that the new gods call the two synonymous. Vinushka is understood as the offspring of Sylvian and Grogoroth, and the domain reflects both creation and destruction. The deity appears differently across different regions of the world. Vinushka's magic includes fire, roots, plant growth, and photosynthesis. The sigil represents constant movement and transformation. According to Enki's unedited skin Bible, the god was originally named Ninush. Mankind once lived in symbiosis with nature. Civilization destroyed that relationship. A war followed, and humanity eventually killed the god. The name Vinushka then came to represent mankind's guilt. According to the censored Vatican version, that death never happened. Humanity and nature are equals, and mankind is entitled to reap what belongs to Vinushka. Donovan Hugo rejects the very idea that an old god can die, creating a direct philosophical challenge to Enki's account. Vinushka's totems or traces still remain. Ikiturso continues waiting. Vinushka's magic continues functioning. And by 1942, the god survives through folklore, botany, and occult knowledge, even if organized worship has largely disappeared from view. Beyond those points, we enter interpretation. Perhaps Vinushka lost only a physical manifestation. Perhaps the divine consciousness died while nature continued. Perhaps nature is dead describes civilization's destruction of wild nature rather than the literal death of a primordial entity. Perhaps logic later inherited the weakened domain and transformed ecological interconnectedness into technological interconnectedness. Perhaps the strange symbols in Vinushka's skin Bible connect this god back to a much higher divine principle through Grogoroth. All of those ideas have evidence worth discussing. None of them are fully settled. And that is probably why Vinushka remains such an interesting old god. The central question is deceptively simple. Can humanity kill nature? Enki says it already did. Hugo says the very idea is absurd. And the world of Termina seems to sit somewhere between those two answers. Nature still functions. Its god may be dead. Its remnants still search. Its magic still answers. And humanity has already begun building something new over the world that remains. Whatever the case, Vinushka is far more than a god of treaties. Vinushka is the cycle through which creation and destruction become nature itself. And if Enki's account is even partly correct, then the greatest wound ever inflicted upon that cycle came from the species that once lived inside it. The god of the depths is one of the older gods worshipped by mankind before humanity turned away from the old world order, and yet compared to Grogoroth or Sylvian, surprisingly little is known about this being. There is no dedicated skin Bible for the god of the depths in Termina. Its gender is inconsistent across the few sources that mention it, and almost everything we know has to be pieced together from dialogue, creatures, skills, the cube of the depths, and most importantly, the dungeons of fear and hunger themselves. Ragnvaldr probably gives us the most useful description when he says that this is a god worshipped by those who are forsaken and forgotten, whose people shy away from the light and prefer the dark corners of the earth. And I think this is a much better place to start than simply calling it a god of darkness, because darkness alone doesn't quite explain what we see in the dungeon. The god of the depths is associated with insects, vermin, decay, revulsion, the loss of consciousness and identity, creatures buried beneath civilization, and the ever-changing structure of the dungeon itself. Unlike most old gods, we don't merely enter a place influenced by this deity. At certain points, we are physically inside it. Its enormous body stretches through the lower levels, with organs appearing in distant parts of the dungeon. And Ragnvaldr identifies the strange passages of the thicket as the intestines of the god of the depths. According to him, the god is even responsible for the dungeon's changing layout, constantly altering its form to challenge those who descend further. This gives us an interesting lore explanation for one of the defining mechanics of fear and hunger, where rooms and routes can change between playthroughs. The dungeon may not be a static piece of architecture at all. It could be a living structure rearranging itself around you. Interestingly, an earlier design idea for the game would apparently have allowed the player to sacrifice a party member to the god of the depths in exchange for changes to the dungeon's layout. That mechanic was never implemented, so I wouldn't treat it as canon, but I do think it tells us something about the intent behind the dungeon's design. At least at one stage, its changing structure was explicitly imagined as something the god of the depths could control, and that makes the physical design of the deity particularly fitting. Its enormous mouth appears to have been inspired by the damaged hawse-hole of the wrecked USS Saratoga, giving the god the appearance of something ancient, submerged and broken open by time. Its sigil is similarly curious. It resembles an inverted Rito rune, a rune traditionally associated with journeys, movement, and the proper rhythm of travel. Read in reverse, it can instead suggest interruption, a blocked path, imbalance, or becoming lost. Of course, this is external symbolism rather than something the game explains directly. But for a god whose domain contains lost people, blocked journeys, and a dungeon that literally rearranges the path ahead of you, the resemblance is certainly interesting. And on that note, there is one other strange detail. Throughout the dungeon, there are plenty of places to pray to Almer, Grogoroth, and Sylvian. But the one place where the player can pray directly to the god of the depths is associated with a statue of Grogoroth in Old Mahabre. I'm not completely sure what to make of that. Perhaps there is a deeper relationship between the two gods. Perhaps Grogoroth's position among the old gods allows his shrine to reach other powers as well. Or perhaps this is simply an unusual gameplay interaction. Whatever the case, it is another reminder that the theology surrounding the god of the depths is incomplete. Almost everything about this god has been buried, which, considering the god we're talking about, is fairly appropriate. So what exactly is the darkness of the god of the depths? The game commonly refers to something called the black, and I think it's important to distinguish this from ordinary darkness. The black doesn't merely obscure vision, it changes things. The new gods describe mumblers as creations of the black, and the same influence appears to transform vegetation into brain flowers and alter creatures such as Moonless. People who lack sufficient physical or mental fortitude can lose themselves beneath the ever-pressing darkness of the dungeon. So the black appears to operate physically and psychologically. It changes bodies, it changes minds, it promotes mutation, it affects plants, it wears away sanity, and perhaps most importantly, it seems capable of drawing out forms that already existed as possibilities within whatever it touches. This is why I don't think the god of the depths should be understood as another Grogoroth. Grogoroth destroys. The black does something stranger. It breaks things down and then allows something different to emerge from what remains. A person becomes a mumbler. A corpse becomes a home for vermin. A trapped grave robber becomes the body snatcher. Plant life becomes something suited to an environment defined by death. Even the butterfly can eventually undergo the metamorphosis it desperately desires. So this is a grotesque form of creation, but it's distinct from Sylvian's creation and distinct from Vinushka's natural cycle. It's life continuing among the things civilization has discarded. And I think the mumbler gives us one of the best clues for understanding this. Ordinary mumblers have almost no recognizable identity left. They communicate poorly and behave as though the black has stripped away much of the consciousness that once made them human. But the greater mumbler is different. According to the new gods, once a mumbler gains consciousness or enlightenment, it can break free from the restraints of the god of the depths. That's a fascinating line. It means consciousness itself can provide a way out. And if that's the case, then perhaps the domain of the god of the depths includes something deeper than physical darkness. Perhaps it represents a state beneath conscious thought, where identity, distinction, and self-awareness begin to dissolve. In that sense, the god of the depths might be understood as something like a primordial unconscious. Its influence appears strongest over beings that act through instinct, beings that have lost themselves, beings that have been forgotten, and beings that no longer know how to find a way out. Enlightenment reverses that process. It produces awareness. It allows distinction. It gives the creature enough understanding to escape. This is still interpretation, but I think it becomes especially compelling once we look at the Cockroach King's quests. The followers of the God of the Depths don't belong to a single species. That is probably the most important thing about them. There are cockroaches, scarabs, cave spiders, cave dwellers, mumblers, the body snatcher, and the strange creature attempting to become the butterfly. What links them isn't biology. It's where they exist. Cockroaches live inside cracks. Vermin survive in places human beings avoid. Cave dwellers live beneath civilization after their ancestors were trapped in darkness. The body snatcher was sealed inside a tomb and turned to the God of the Depths when there was nowhere else to go. Mumblers are what remains of people destroyed by the Black. Ragnvaldr's description is therefore remarkably precise. These are the forsaken and forgotten. The God of the Depths doesn't necessarily gather evil creatures. It gathers what no longer has a place beneath the light. And insects are the perfect creatures to represent such a domain. They predate human civilization. They survive underground. They feed upon corpses and waste. They live inside the spaces civilization tries to seal away. Many function through colonies and simple behavioral patterns rather than the sort of individual identity mankind likes to consider uniquely important. They thrive in environments we call revolting. Rotten food, corpses, bodily fluids, parasites, disease, and decay all inspire disgust, precisely because human beings instinctively want to keep away from them. Yet the ecology of the depths is built from those things. And perhaps that's what revulsion means in this context. The God of the depths presides over the parts of existence that life depends upon, but consciousness would rather not acknowledge. The Cockroach King is the clearest organized servant of this system. He rules over the insects of the thicket, and you can only understand him if you possess mastery over insects. When you approach, he is surprised that a human can speak to his kind and demands that you kneel. If you accept your position beneath him, he calls you a peasant and gives you a task. Kill the butterfly. Do that, and you become a noble. Then comes another task. Kill Enki, the long, fair-haired priest of destruction, so the Cockroach King's people may have magical flesh for a new home. Complete that, and you rise again, becoming a knight. This is also one of the only reliable ways to build affinity with the God of the depths, which is very unusual. With many gods, affinity comes from prayer, ritual, or sacrifice. Here it comes through insects, submission, and murder carried out on behalf of their king. But why the butterfly and Enki specifically? The butterfly is a tempting transformation. Enki possesses the enlightened soul. And if consciousness or enlightenment really can free a creature from the God of the depths, then a servant of that God ordering the death of Enki becomes extremely interesting. Enki represents knowledge, self-awareness, and the ability to study powers beyond mankind without simply surrendering to them. If the depths represent the darkness beneath the conscious mind, the enlightened soul becomes a natural opposition to that domain. Again, I don't think we can prove that this is the intended reason behind the quest. The Cockroach King is also perfectly happy to explain that his people simply want Enki's magical flesh. But the overlap is worth noticing. The butterfly is even stranger. The new gods say the creature seeks the gift of the God of the depths and dismiss the attempt as futile. Yet under the right circumstances, the butterfly actually transforms and flies away, leaving behind the butterfly soul. So the depths appear capable of metamorphosis as well as degeneration. A creature considered wretched by everyone around it can enter this darkness and eventually emerge in the form it desired. Whether this transformation was truly a blessing from the god of the depths is unclear, but I think the possibility is important. The black doesn't only reduce, sometimes it changes. There were human worshippers as well. Hundreds of years before the events of the first game, the hermit mages of the south dedicated themselves to the god of the depths. The Leechmonger ring tells us that these mages were capable of infusing rings with life-draining magic, though almost nothing else about their order survives. This is another recurring pattern with the deity. Its cults exist at the edges of history, leaving behind techniques rather than a complete theology. The spells associated with the depths follow the same pattern. Mastery over insects allows communication with insectoid creatures throughout the dungeon. Cockroaches can provide small pieces of information, gifts, and warnings. Scarabs and other creatures gain unique dialogue. The player can speak with the cockroach king. Needleworm harnesses the strength of 100 leeches at the cost of carrying those parasites inside the body. Locust swarm summons insects to disrupt an enemy. Taken at face value, these abilities seem almost unimpressive compared to the overwhelming spells associated with old gods, such as Grogoroth or Sylvian. But I think that misses the larger point. Insects and vermin may only be the carriers. The true power associated with the depths is what they spread. Darkness, decay, disease, transformation. This is where the kingdom of Rondon becomes particularly important. Even while the god of the depths appears to be in a weakened, almost dying condition beneath the dungeon, the creatures and darkness spreading from that place are associated with a mysterious plague devastating Rondon and killing much of its population. So the effect of the deity extends far beyond the chambers in which its organs lie. The god doesn't need to walk across the surface itself. Vermin can do that. Disease can do that. And once we get to its successor, the same principle becomes much larger. The god of fear and hunger would later bring mankind into the cruel age through fear, hunger, disease, and war, forcing civilization forward into new forms of science and technology. There is a grim historical logic to that idea. Large catastrophes force societies to respond. Epidemics such as the Black Death, and much more recently COVID, are obvious real-world examples of crises that forced human beings to adapt. The pattern is simple enough. Humanity stagnates. Disaster arrives. Humanity is forced to respond. Those who survive enter a world changed by that response. And I think this is where the apparently minor vermin magic of the god of the depths starts to look much more significant. Insects aren't necessarily the power. They're the delivery system. But the strangest worshipper of all may have been a woman remembered only as the Maiden of the Depths. According to an old folk tale, the god of the depths took this human woman as a bride, though their union was impossible because she remained mortal. Even so, the maiden attempted to connect the human realm with the divine. We eventually find her fused into the tree of the depths in the hidden backyard, her body seemingly becoming part of a living structure that reaches down through the thicket. The thicket itself is said to have formed when a human woman fell in love with the god of the depths and became a tree in an attempt to reach the forgotten deity below. Its roots descend all the way to level 7, where one of the god's organs can be found. Inside the thicket are insects, brain flowers, the cockroach king, and human bodies fused into its walls, presumably placed there by mumblers so they can undergo similar changes. So the maiden's story is more than a strange romance. Her body becomes a path. A mortal woman literally changes herself into a structure capable of reaching towards an old god. And I wonder if this might help explain the terrible condition in which we eventually find the god of the depths. This part is speculative, but perhaps the attempt to unite the human and divine realms did succeed to some degree. Maybe the maiden reached the god. Maybe the god answered. And perhaps maintaining that connection placed an enormous strain upon both of them. The maiden became the tree, her roots descending deeper and surrounding one of the god's hearts. The god of the depths, for its part, seems to have spread itself throughout the dungeon until body, architecture, and underground space became almost impossible to separate. If the two were attempting to create a route between the human world and something beyond it, perhaps even the void, then the result might be the distorted state we see in 1590. I don't think we have enough evidence to say the maiden caused the god's decline. But the story does give us an interesting possibility. Both beings attempt something that should be impossible. A human joining an old god, and two realms being connected through living flesh. The result is a union of sorts. It just doesn't resemble anything mankind would consider beautiful. And perhaps the sigil resembling an inverted journey takes on another meaning here as well. The maiden tries to travel where a human being should not. Instead of crossing that distance normally, she becomes the road. And speaking of impossible roads, we have to talk about the Cube of the Depths. This is probably the most important artifact associated with the deity. The cube is required to access Mahabre, but calling it a key doesn't really describe what it does. It can activate the Beacon of the Depths, open access to the City of the Gods, and interact with the temporal states of Mahabre, allowing movement between its past and present forms. Miro has compared the cube to the Lament configuration from Hellraiser, which is fitting because that puzzle box doesn't simply unlock a physical door either. It opens access to another state of reality. The cube appears to do something similar. So where did an artifact capable of manipulating space and time come from? Strangely, we first hear of it far away from the dungeon, across the Western Ocean in Vinland. The first recorded contact between Europa and Vinland dates to Oldegordian explorers in the year 1009. Another expedition from Abyssonia followed in 1310, but an established route wasn't formed until Oldegordian sailors returned in 1577. The continent became known as Vinland, or Wineland, supposedly because those who returned needed a great deal of wine to forget what they had experienced there. A Vatican scholar writing in 1650 described soil that seemed to reject sunlight and warmth, turning the landscape into a continuous, colorless black mass, where the hills, basins, and even the few plants capable of surviving became difficult to distinguish. The land is cursed. The land is morbid and dark. Settlers returned with intensely personal nightmares, and the scholar concluded that discovering the continent might have been mankind's greatest mistake. Even by 1942, Vinland remained largely unexplored and resistant to colonization, though trade in goods such as tobacco and Old Vinland whiskey continued. And despite the way Western records describe the continent as unsettled, there are clearly native societies there. Warrior tribes exist in northern Vinland, using weapons such as the ornate Sergal spear, and Rancid the Sergal belongs to one of these cultures. The new gods themselves admit that they know remarkably little about Vinland, describing it as a continent tightly connected to the older gods. And Ragnvaldr makes the connection more personal. He says the moment you look upon Vinland's crooked mountains and twisted forests, you can feel the presence of a greater evil, and that it is the same evil he senses inside the dungeons of fear and hunger. Ragnvaldr knew this because he had been there. As the winters of Oldegord became colder and its summers shorter, hunger drove him and other men westward in search of resources and wealth. Many died or went mad, but the expedition survived long enough to recover the Cube of the Depths. That discovery ultimately brought catastrophe home. Legard and the Knights of the Midnight Sun invaded Oldegord to seize the cube, killing Ragnvaldr's people, including his wife Hilda and his child Björn. Ragnvaldr eventually followed Legard into the dungeon, carrying that grief and desire for revenge with him. Captain Ruddimer would later trade the cube to the cave dwellers in exchange for provisions as the dungeon consumed his sanity, and the cave dwellers placed it upon a crude altar and defended it violently. So the cube travels from Vinland to Oldegord, from Oldegord to Legard's campaign, into the dungeon, into the hands of Ruddimer, and finally to the cave dwellers, before the player uses it to reach Mahabra. And the question remains, why was it in Vinland at all? We don't know. Perhaps the influence of the god of the depths once reached much further than the dungeon. Perhaps an ancient civilization carried the cube there. Perhaps Vinland has its own connection to the black. Or perhaps the cube belongs to an older divine infrastructure that was never limited to one place. Whatever the case, the cube eventually becomes important far beyond Mahabra. The same artifact is tied to the later ascension of logic and humanity's attempt to build its own paradise. So a relic of the god of the depths ultimately helps open the way not only to the city of the gods, but to another god entirely. Back in the dungeon, the god of the depths is alive enough to possess 3 enormous hearts. One lies on level 7 near the place where Lagarde can be found. Another is buried at the bottom of the thicket, at the end of the roots associated with the Maiden of the Depths. The third lies at the end of the present-day Golden Temple, near the aged Francoise. Destroying all 3 causes the enormous mouth of the god of the depths to open, allowing the player to enter the gauntlet. And I think the placement of these hearts says something important about what this creature has become. One heart lies beneath the dungeon proper. One is wrapped into the living architecture of the thicket. One lies within the remains of Mahabra's religious and political history. The god seems to have absorbed everything around it until the boundary between organism, dungeon, city, and temple has broken down. This is why I think the god of the depths can also be understood as something like an archive of what history has thrown away. Civilizations discard prisoners. They bury corpses. They exile people. They throw waste underground. They forget old religions. They build new cities over old ones. And beneath all of that, the discarded material remains. In fear and hunger, it almost feels as if all of those things were pushed into the same place until the place itself became divine. The dungeon contains obsolete gods, forgotten people, failed ascendants, abandoned cults, lost architecture, vermin, corpses, and creatures no longer capable of living beneath the surface. Under that interpretation, the god of the depths becomes the cost of civilization, pretending that what it removes from sight has ceased to exist. And once those 3 hearts are destroyed, we travel through the mouth of that forgotten god and enter the gauntlet, perhaps the most lethal area in the entire first game. At its end is the Heart of Darkness. And this is where the role of the god of the depths changes completely. At the end of the gauntlet, 2 very different conclusions are possible. Without the girl, the player may eventually encounter the traces of Grogoroth. With the girl, something else happens. The girl is the child of Nilvan and Lagarde, and the new gods describe her soul as possessing a light comparable to that of an older god, despite being contained inside a human child. Nilvan's plan is for the player to take her to the deepest point of the dungeon. And when the girl finally reaches the Heart of Darkness inside the body of the god of the depths, her ascension begins. The skin Bible of the god of fear and hunger later tells us that the god of the depths perished that night, while the influence of the newborn god began spreading across the surface world. So the body of the depths was more than a location for the ascension. It was a vessel, almost a womb. Nilvan and Lagarde created the child capable of becoming something greater, but the god of the depths provided the divine environment in which that transformation could occur. The girl enters its body. The old god dies. The new god is born, and the continuity between them is difficult to ignore. The god of fear and hunger inherits associations with vermin and darkness, while her symbol appears to be constructed by duplicating and reflecting the sigil of the god of the depths into something resembling an R and its mirror. I think this is some of the strongest visual evidence that the 2 domains are related. The god of fear and hunger isn't merely born near the god of the depths. Her divine identity appears to grow from what the older god leaves behind. In that sense, the death of the depths becomes a transition rather than an ending. What once belonged beneath the world begins spreading across its surface. The god of the depths protected or transformed the forgotten creatures below civilization. The god of fear and hunger brings fear, hunger, plague, and suffering to civilization itself. And from that suffering begins the cruel age. This is where the apparent weakness of the god of the depths' magic becomes misleading. Mastery over insects, leeches, and locusts sound minor beside the spectacular magic of other gods, but the successor to this domain reveals what vermin can actually accomplish when the principle is expanded across civilization. The god of fear and hunger ushers mankind into an age of disease, war, fear, and starvation, and those pressures force humanity to advance. Science develops, technology develops, cities and industry expand. Eventually, the world reaches the conditions necessary for logic. So the strange history surrounding the god of the depths starts to form a causal chain. The old god's influence spreads through darkness and vermin. Rondon suffers. The god of the depths dies. The god of fear and hunger is born from its body. The cruel age begins. Humanity is driven forward through suffering. Industrial and technological civilization follows. Vinushka's domain weakens as nature is exploited. Logic eventually ascends through another ancient divine foundation, with the cube of the depths itself once again playing a part. I don't think we should interpret this as proof that the god of the depths consciously planned every event. Ragnvaldr actually says something that pushes against that idea. He believes the evil in the dungeon is no longer interested in spreading into the surrounding world. The dungeon is merely a relic from a much older history, and the god's interests have already passed beyond this world. So perhaps the god of the depths didn't need to act intentionally at all. Its death was enough. One event became the cause of another, which became the cause of another, until centuries later the consequences looked as though someone had arranged the pieces in advance. And this is what brings me to a comparison I've made before with Berserk. If you've seen my Berserk videos, then you might remember the concept of the law of causality, or Inga. In Berserk, history is shaped through enormous chains of cause and effect. A kingdom falls, someone finds a Bahilit, a person is born into a particular bloodline, and each event becomes another link leading towards something that appears almost predetermined. The idea of evil sits at the deepest layer of that cosmology, born from mankind's collective desire for a reason behind suffering, while the God Hand act as agents through which that causal structure reaches the physical world. Flora explains that causality isn't quite a perfect circle. It is closer to a spiral. Similar events return in new forms with different participants and slightly different outcomes. Guts and Skull Knight are unusual because they exist at the edge of this flow, sometimes compared to fish capable of briefly leaping above the surface of a river. They can create disturbances, but that doesn't necessarily mean they can redirect the entire current. Guts surviving the eclipse and carrying the brand of sacrifice leaves him within the interstice between physical and spiritual existence, which helps explain why he can resist forces that would otherwise seem inevitable. I bring this up because fear and hunger repeatedly gives me a similar impression. Though to be clear, I'm using Berserk as an analog here, rather than claiming both universes operate under the same literal rule. Look at the chain we've already discussed across these videos. Aemon disappears. Almer rises. Vinushka dies or is diminished. The god of the depths dies. The god of fear and hunger is born. The cruel age begins. Humanity changes. Logic emerges. Even old gods appear to become causes and consequences inside a much larger historical flow. The god of the depths itself might be one of the clearest examples. Its death appears catastrophic, yet that death provides the conditions for a god that fundamentally changes humanity. And the cube associated with the depths survives long enough to participate in another divine ascension centuries later. This is why I find the possibility of some larger causal structure in fear and hunger so interesting. It could explain why so many apparently unrelated catastrophes eventually lead into the same direction. But there is one character that I think complicates this entire idea: the sulfur god. Under the theory we've discussed before, sulfur exists as something rejected and chained at the edge of the world, a being separated from the order established around Almer. And perhaps that position makes sulfur unusually difficult to place inside the same causal structure. If most gods and humans are pieces moving through a sequence visible to some higher principle, then sulfur and the cult built around him might represent a variable capable of disrupting that sequence. Chaos inserted into a system that otherwise appears to move towards predetermined results. This is highly speculative territory, of course. We have no text explicitly saying the god of the depths died because some supreme being had already foreseen the god of fear and hunger. We have no confirmation that the sulfur god literally exists outside causality. But I think the pattern is worth keeping in mind as we move through the rest of the old gods, because the history of fear and hunger repeatedly turns destruction into the foundation for whatever comes next. In the end, the god of the depths is difficult to define precisely because almost every part of its lore comes from something indirect. Its followers explain one part, the dungeon explains another. The black shows us what its influence can do to bodies and minds. The maiden gives us a story about a human trying to bridge the distance between mankind and an old god. The cube connects the deity to Vinland, Mahabra, space, time, and eventually logic. The three hearts reveal that the god's body has become part of the dungeon itself, and the birth of the god of fear and hunger shows that even the death of an old god can become the foundation for another divine age. What I think we can say with reasonable confidence is that the god of the depths represents much more than an absence of light. Its domain includes inescapable darkness, revulsion, vermin, decay, transformation, and the beings that civilization leaves beneath itself. The black can erode consciousness, yet consciousness can also provide a way out. Its followers are not united by species, but by abandonment. Its insects live where humanity refuses to look. Its creatures feed upon what humanity throws away, and its body eventually becomes the place where another god is born. By 1942, the god of the depths is gone in the sense that its old physical form perished in 1590, yet its influence has not disappeared completely. The beekeepers remain as one expression of that legacy. The cube survives, and most importantly, the domain continues through the god of fear and hunger. So perhaps the most fitting thing about the god of the depths is that even after history forgets the god, the things beneath history keep working. The corpses remain, the insects remain, the darkness remains, and from what was left behind, something else eventually takes form. Sarko is perhaps the most difficult old god on the museum clock to discuss, because almost everything we know about this entity comes from a symbol rather than a story. 3 names connected to otherwise unidentified sigils can be found within the game files: Amun in the 1st position, Turkil in the 7th, and Sarko in the 10th and final position. Unlike Amun, whose sigil also appears in the Book of Enlightenment and the Heartless One's Curse of Light, Sarko has no dialogue, no known worshippers, no dedicated skill tree, and no text that directly explains what this god represents. Even the name itself never appears openly within the story. What we have instead are 3 appearances of the same symbol in the first Fear and Hunger, long before the museum clock appears in Termina. The first is inside the ancient book. The second is in the level 2 basement, beside an enormous ritual symbol associated with the god of the depths. And the third belongs to the Black Witch, who uses this same star-shaped circle whenever she appears, disappears, or drags her victims somewhere beyond the ordinary dungeon. Those three appearances are essentially the entire foundation for everything we're about to discuss. So from the beginning, I want to be clear about the distinction here. Sarko is the internal name associated with the 10th symbol. Everything beyond that has to be reconstructed from placement, imagery, and the strange things that happen whenever this sigil appears. And I think the Black Witch gives us the best place to start. The Black Witch was once human. At some point, she sold her soul to the blood arts, immersed herself in dark magic, and became corrupted by the darkness of the dungeon. When asked about her power, she explains that she channels Grogoroth, or whatever remains of him, which is what people traditionally call blood magic. This matters because the Black Witch is sometimes treated as evidence that Sarko must have had a surviving priestess, but the game never says that. Her allegiance is to Grogoroth. Her spells include Black Orb and other forms of blood magic, and the new gods describe her as something closer to a slave of the god of destruction. What makes her important to Sarko is the fact that one of her most unusual powers does not resemble ordinary blood magic at all. The Black Witch can materialize from the strange 5-pointed ritual circle associated with Sarko and disappear through it again. More importantly, she can pull her victim into a place commonly referred to as the flip side. Once there, the player can encounter something that looks like their own corpse, and even a grave bearing their identity, while they are still very much alive. Defeating the Black Witch returns the victim to the normal dungeon, but the game never explains what the flip side actually is. It could be a physical location. It could be another reality. It could be an illusion imposed upon the victim's mind. Whatever the case, normal space is clearly behaving strangely, and the appearance of the player's own dead body introduces something more than simple teleportation. Space, identity, and death all seem to overlap here. And then there is the Black Witch's attitude towards death itself. When threatened, she says, "I don't fear death. It's only one stepping stone on my path." On its own, that could simply describe her confidence in the blood arts. But placed beside a ritual symbol that repeatedly carries her across boundaries, and beside a realm where the living can encounter their own death, I think the wording becomes much more interesting. Perhaps the sigil associated with Sarko has less to do with stars than with crossing from one state into another. Death, under that interpretation, would be another boundary, another threshold. The symbol itself is usually described as something like a headless pentagram, a 5-pointed star whose upper point appears to have been removed or inverted into another shape. During my research, one visual comparison stood out to me. The heartagram created by Vilvalo of the Finnish Gothic rock band Him. The heartagram combines a heart with an inverted pentagram so that the two forms overlap, producing a shape that can resemble a broken or incomplete star, depending on how you look at it. Vilvalo described the symbol through oppositions such as love and death, happiness and sorrow, light and darkness, two forces existing together rather than canceling one another out. Now, I would be very careful with this comparison. There is no statement from Miro saying Sarko's sigil was inspired by the heartagram. The resemblance alone proves nothing. That said, Miro is Finnish, and we already know he has drawn inspiration from music elsewhere, with Vinushka being partially inspired by the Deer and Grey song of the same name. So I don't think the possibility is unreasonable. More importantly, the meaning traditionally associated with the heartagram happens to fit surprisingly well with what the Sarko symbol seems to do in the game. The Black Witch moves between ordinary existence and something associated with death. A boundary that appears final becomes traversable. Opposing states begin to overlap. Life and death, presence and absence, here and somewhere else. Again, this doesn't identify Sarko's domain by itself, but it gives us a useful direction. and the ancient book makes the problem even stranger. The ancient book is one of the most dangerous occult texts in the first game. It goes by several names: the Rites of Madness, Al-Azif, Ex Mortis, the Necronomicon, and most importantly for us, the Testament of Grogoroth. Reading it can grant necromancy, blood golem, hurting, or black orb, all spells associated with Grogoroth. Fail to withstand what is inside, and the reader simply loses their mind. The book describes powers beyond human understanding, reducing the reader to little more than a feeble ant beside the presence being summoned through its pages. The connection to Grogoroth is therefore unmistakable. Yet, among the symbols displayed within this book are signs associated with Sylvian, the god of the depths, and the mysterious sigil later identified internally as Sarko. Sylvian's presence is easy enough to understand. She is Grogoroth's consort and direct opposite. The god of the depths is more difficult, though we already discussed the strange relationship between these two beings in the previous chapter, including the fact that the traces of Grogoroth can be reached deep within the body of the depths, and that prayer to the god of the depths can strangely be performed through a Grogoroth statue in Old Mahabharata. Sarko appearing in the same text therefore raises a question. Why would a symbol associated with an otherwise forgotten god be preserved inside something called the Testament of Grogoroth? The word testament itself is broad. It can refer to a covenant, a written testimony, or something left behind as a declaration of legacy. I wouldn't push the linguistic connection too far, but the book clearly gathers powers and symbols closely surrounding Grogoroth, and Sarko appears among them. The level 2 basement gives us an even more direct visual connection. There, a huge ritual symbol belonging to the god of the depths dominates the room, while the smaller Sarko-like star appears nearby, together with another mark resembling imagery associated with Grogoroth. Behind the reinforced door is miasma, one of the most dangerous weapons in the dungeon. The difference in scale between the depth symbol and Sarko's symbol is especially interesting to me. Sarko doesn't appear beside the depths as an equal visual presence. The smaller sign almost looks enclosed within the larger religious space surrounding the older deity. Maybe that means nothing. Or perhaps it reflects dependence, inheritance, or a relationship where Sarko emerged from something already belonging to the depths. For a long time, the name Sarko gave me almost nothing to work with. I couldn't find a convincing theological or mythological figure under that exact name. Eventually, I started considering whether the name itself might have been altered. Miro occasionally plays with names in strange ways. Rancid the Sergal, for example, is also associated with the name Mataneko Kone Magnificat, and the Nekomata reference inside that naming provides at least one example where familiar material is rearranged into something stranger. So what happens if we do something similar with Sarko? Rearranged slightly, the name brings us surprisingly close to Sokar. Sokar is one of the oldest funerary gods of ancient Egypt, associated with the necropolis of Memphis, the land of the dead, rebirth, and a region called Rosatau, an entrance into the hidden depths of the underworld. Sokar also possesses an important connection to craftsmanship and the forging of divine objects. And suddenly, several pieces surrounding Sarko begin to line up in a way I find very difficult to ignore. The Sarko circle is used to cross into the flip side. The Black Witch encounters death as another stage of a journey. The symbol appears beside the god of the depths, whose entire domain lies beneath the ordinary world. And behind that same ritual area waits Miasma, a sentient, otherworldly sword whose origins remain unexplained. If Sarko was inspired in any way by Sokar, then the domain might concern the passage into the world of the dead rather than death itself. Grogoroth already embodies destruction and death in a much broader sense. Sarko would have no reason to duplicate that role. What remains open is the transition, the road between states. the place the dead pass through, the ability to move from the ordinary world into another layer of existence. Under this reading, the Black Witch's powers begin to make much more sense. She channels Grogoroth for blood magic, while Sarko's sigil provides something else entirely: passage. Miasma makes this theory even more tempting, though I want to stress that the connection is entirely circumstantial. Miasma is an otherworldly sentient sword said to contain the strength of 6 men. It releases toxic gas, communicates directly with the mind of its wielder, and was forged with the purpose of spreading chaos, pain, and misery. The sword constantly attempts to manipulate whoever carries it into killing others, and its voice becomes especially dangerous once the wielder's mental defenses begin to collapse. Much later, something resembling the same sword can be seen lodged inside Moonless. What we don't know is who created Miasma. The game never identifies its smith. But the weapon is sealed directly behind the ritual area, containing the God of the Depth symbol and the smaller Sarko-like mark. And if the Sokar comparison has any value, then this placement becomes interesting, because Sokar was also associated with divine craftsmanship. Could Sarko have forged Miasma? Perhaps. Could the same god have had some relationship with the creation of legendary weapons such as Red Virtue and Blue Sin? It's an attractive theory, particularly because those weapons belong to the ancient world of Mahabharata. But right now there is no direct evidence for either claim. I would place the forging idea well below the dimensional interpretation. Miasma's location gives us a clue. It doesn't give us a creator. Still, the combination of underworld imagery, passage between realms, and sacred craftsmanship is enough that I don't think Sokar can be dismissed as a meaningless coincidence. And this brings us back to the God of the Depths. If Sarko really does belong beside this deity, what kind of relationship would make sense? I don't think the answer is light against darkness, and I don't think life against death works either. The God of the Depths already encompasses the forgotten, the forsaken, the black, decay, darkness, and the places into which things disappear. Sarko, based on the Black Witch's powers, seems much more concerned with what happens when a boundary is crossed. So the relationship I find most useful is something closer to the abyss and the threshold. The depths are where the road disappears. Sarko would be the principle that allows another road to begin. Something falls beneath the world into the domain of the depths. Sarko governs the crossing that follows. Under that interpretation, death becomes especially important, because death is the final threshold every living thing eventually reaches. The Black Witch's words fit almost perfectly. Death is a stepping stone, a transition between states. The flip side may therefore represent a space where that transition becomes visible, a place where someone can encounter the possibility of their own death while still possessing enough identity to return. And this also offers one possible explanation for why Sarko's symbol appears smaller beside the sigil of the depths. Perhaps Sarko emerged from the larger principle represented by the depths. Perhaps one governs the place beyond the boundary, while the other governs the act of crossing it. That leads into the most speculative theory of all. Sarko could somehow have been born from the god of the depths and Grogoroth. Grogoroth supplies death and destruction. The depths supplies the hidden space beneath ordinary existence and already possesses strange relationships with roots between worlds. Sarko, if born from those principles, could inherit both: death from Grogoroth and transition between realms from the depths. The placement on the museum clock gives the idea at least a little structural support, because Sarko appears immediately after the god of the depths and occupies the final position. The ancient book places Sarko in the same religious environment as Grogoroth and the depths. The basement repeats the association visually, and the Black Witch, a Grogoroth follower, uses Sarko's symbol to cross boundaries. I think that's enough to make the theory worth discussing. It is nowhere near enough to call it fact. There is no canonical text naming Sarko as anyone's child, and we still don't understand exactly what the ordering of the museum clock means. So for now, I would treat lineage as a secondary theory rather than the foundation of Sarko's identity. There is one final detail that I find particularly fitting. Sarko occupies the 10th and final position on the clock. If Amun at the beginning can be associated with the sun, illumination, and the beginning of a cycle, then Sarko at the opposite end might represent what happens when that cycle reaches its boundary. Again, I wouldn't treat the clock as a proven chronology, but symbolically, the arrangement works remarkably well with the domain we've been discussing. Sarko would govern an ending that still contains movement. Death as passage, rather than absolute termination. The last point upon the clock becomes another threshold. And perhaps that also explains why Sarko has almost no presence in ordinary human worship. If this god belongs primarily to the boundary between states, or to a realm beyond ordinary existence, then its absence from the surface world would make sense. There is no Sarko skill tree, no obvious cult, no priesthood we can identify with confidence. What survives is a symbol inside ancient occult material, a ritual circle beneath the dungeon, and a witch capable of moving somewhere ordinary humans probably shouldn't be able to reach. That's very little evidence, but the evidence we do have is strangely consistent. Sarko's sigil appears where boundaries become unstable. The Black Witch crosses through it. The flip side confuses life and death. The symbol stands beside the god of the depths and appears within the testament of Grogoroth. The name may point towards Sokar, an underworld deity concerned with death, rebirth, and passage through the hidden world. And the symbol itself may carry imagery built around opposing states existing together. So if I had to give Sarko a working domain from everything we currently have, I wouldn't call him a god of stars, and I wouldn't reduce him to another god of death. I think something like a god of thresholds is much closer, a deity associated with passage between states, between worlds, and perhaps between life and whatever comes after it. The god of the depths would be the abyss into which forgotten things descend. Sarko would be the crossing hidden at its furthest edge. Whether Sarko is truly the child of Grogoroth and the depths, whether the god forged miasma, whether the flip side is part of Sarko's own realm, and whether Sokar genuinely inspired the name, are all questions we simply cannot answer yet. And I have to admit, even after spending so much time on this theory, I'm still not completely satisfied with it. There are too many missing pieces, and the relationship between Sarko and the depths still lacks the kind of direct evidence we have for pairs such as Sylvian and Grogoroth. But perhaps that's appropriate for the final god on this clock. Sarko remains at the edge of what we know, represented by a symbol that opens into somewhere else. And with that, we've finally reached the last of the 10 gods represented upon the museum clock. It's strangely fitting that the final chapter ends with a deity whose possible domain concerns endings that become another passage. Because this is also where this series ends. That doesn't mean there is nowhere else to go. As the Black Witch puts it, death is only one stepping stone on the path. So perhaps Sarko is as good a place as any to leave this particular journey behind and move towards whatever comes next.